sharing from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, really concerning that covenant promise that God had made with Abraham based upon a relationship built upon the foundation of faith. How many of you know that we're saved by grace through faith, not of works, so that no one ever should boast? And when the Son of Man comes, what's he going to be looking for? He's going to be looking for faith. He's not going to be looking for good intentions. He's not going to be looking for religious affiliation. It says when he comes, will he find faith on the earth? That is what he's going to do. So we examine ourselves to see what? Whether or not we be in the faith. And so when it comes down to it, it comes down to this thing called faith. And folks, listen, you've heard me preach it. I've taught it many times. You've read it in the Word that faith is the substance. It's the hypostasis. It's the reality. Faith has got to become your reality in 2019. It can't just be some force of nature or something that is some extension of God. It's got to become your reality. If you're going to be the justified that walk by faith, that's got to be the reality of your life. It can't be just something that you put on periodically. It's got to be how you're defined. Do you hear me? And so when he comes and the master of the house returns, will he find you so doing? Doing what? Walking by faith. And I'm not just talking about the faith in the abstract. I'm talking about faith in the finished work of the cross of Calvary. Do you believe what he did? Do you believe it? Do you believe what he said? Amen. Do you believe his promises? Do you believe his empowerment? All of those things are encompassed in the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You remember that relationship of faith. It came with 7 distinct promises and 3 really required stipulations. And you remember we talked about the 7 promises. Let's read them quickly. He said, I'll make you a great nation. He said, I'll bless you. He said, I'll make you famous, or I'll give you a great testimony. He said, I'll make you a blessing to other people. Those that bless you, he'll bless. Those that curse you, he'll curse. And he says, you will be the key wherein all subsequent families of the earth will also be blessed. In other words, you're going to be that conduit. When you walk by faith, when you enter into that covenant, when you press into that place that he has for you, you're going to be the vehicle. Folks, see, that excites me. Amen. I don't want to be a spectator in the things of God. Do you hear me? I want to be a player in the things of God in the sense that God can use me. He can trust me to be that conduit and be that vehicle. So many people are satisfied with sitting on the sidelines, just being an observer, a casual observer in the things of God. Folks, listen, I want to be smack dab in the middle of everything that God is doing. Folks, I heard for years growing up, in the Spirit-filled church, and people want to do something. They say, God, I'm praying and I want God to anoint what I'm doing. God, here's my vision. Here's my plan. Please anoint it. Folks, I abandoned that philosophy 30 years ago. And I don't say, God, I want you to anoint what I'm doing. I just want to get in the middle of whatever God is in the middle of. Do you hear me? That way, God is in the middle of it. If God is anointing it, that's where I want to be. Amen. I don't say, God, I want you to change your course of action. I don't want to change your plan. I don't want somehow for you to tweak things in order to suffice my disobedience or to have something else that's a plan B for me. Lord God, whatever you're doing, wherever you're at, I want to find myself right there in that place looking towards you. And so we saw the 7 promises that were there and still are. And then we see the 3 conditions or stipulations that were and also still are. Remember what he said? He told Abraham, he said, I want you to leave your home country. He said, I want you to leave your extended family or your kindred. Then I want you to leave your immediate family. And I broke those down. Yes, give your life to Christ and secure that place of eternity. Most everyone here has probably done that. We've prayed the prayer. We've confessed our sins. We've done all those things. And we said, listen, I don't want to go to hell. Anybody here that I missed, that you've got a beeline for destruction and you want to party with the devil in hell and be like just some lost heathens. Is that what you want to do? Anybody here? So we've all done stipulation number 1. We want to leave our home country. We realize that we are just sojourners. We are just strangers in a strange land, and we're pressing towards that place where he said that he's gone to prepare a place for me, right? And where he is, I'm going to be also. That's me. My citizenship is not here. I guess temporarily I have a dual citizenship. It's here in the United States of America, and it's also in heaven. But I'm just here temporarily, amen. I'm not waving, oh glory, amen. He's my glory and the lifter of my head. So that's it. I've left my home country. And yes, you cease from the obvious works of the flesh that disqualify you from the kingdom of heaven. Yes, yes. And so the works of the flesh, we see them, they're evident. We know that in 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, these things that we do, those obvious things of leaving our extended family, those things that we've come accustomed to. Yes, yes, we do both of those things. I want to go to heaven. I don't want to be a drug addict. I don't want to be a pervert. I don't want to be a liar. I don't want to be a thief. Obviously, those type of things. Then remember that third stipulation that I think people kind of run aground on, but you have got to go a lot deeper into the issues of the heart, those things that are so personal, those things that cause you to say, I just want to do me. Folks, I don't want to do me. Me had citizenship somewhere else. Me was bound up by those things that I don't want to be bound up by. Amen? I don't want to do me. I want to be like John, who said, me has got to decrease so that he can increase. The more of me, the less of him. The less of me, the more of him. Amen? So I want to make room in this coming year for more of him. Folks, listen, I've been walking with Jesus for 34 years. I'm not satisfied. You hear me? I'm not satisfied. I'm not satiated by where I've been. I don't think to myself, man, I've arrived and I'm okay and I can just put it on the proverbial cruise control and cruise into the kingdom. Man, I want God to challenge me. I want to be more radical for him. I want to be more aggressive in pursuing his presence than never before. You know why? Because nearer is my salvation than when I first believed. In other words, that gap is closing. That distance is closing. Not just through time and space, but through wisdom and understanding and through revelation and through those requirements and the expectations that he has for me. I want 20 and 19 to be a time of closing the distance. Amen? Do you find yourself sometimes kind of just pulling over to the side of the road and being in some spiritual rest stop in 2018? Have you advanced further in the last 12 months than where you were a year ago? I'm hoping to some degree it's yes. Maybe some of you have thought to yourself, man, I remember last year or 2 years ago, man, God was really stirring me, doing something in my heart. And man, I just feel like I'm just going through the motions. Folks, it's time to repent and to believe the gospel and allow God to put you back on that course. And like we sing that song, let it be an active pursuit and a participation in his presence. So the scene is set. The invitation into that covenant has been extended. The promises have been revealed. The criteria is established. Now it's time to walk those things out. You hear me? That's where Abraham found himself. All of those things, the promises, the good news for him was laid before him. But he's told, listen, here's what you got to do to obtain that. And now it's time to walk those things out. Folks, listen, let me tell you this, and maybe most of you probably know this. Anytime you decide to advance in the promises of God, there is always going to be a test or trial that you're going to encounter along the way. Anybody been in a battle of late? I know some of you definitely have been in the battle of your life of late. Folks, listen, you're never going to really know a good victory until you've been in a good fight. I'm just going to tell you right up. Usually, on the other side of your biggest battle is your biggest blessing. And I'm not talking about gold and silver you're talking in your pockets. I'm talking about in your biggest battle. If you pursue after him, you're going to find the greatest and the deepest revelation of Jesus Christ and a satisfaction in him that you've never seen before. And so you'll never take ground spiritually unopposed, and you'll never know that victory until you've engaged in a genuine battle with the adversary. But here's the problem. Most people, most Christians, let's just talk about us for just a minute. They respond actually in one of two ways when they're confronted. Number one, they'll wilt under the pressure and they'll pull up lame in the midst of the battle. Folks, I've seen so many people, the first time a trial comes, the first time some type of opposition comes, it's like a racehorse breaking a shin bone in a Kentucky Derby. They're to stop on the track, and somebody has to come up and they have to put them down. So many Christians have just come up lame when they're running that race, and they've just got to spiritually be put down. And some people, they convince themselves that the presence of opposition means the absence of the presence of God. Did you hear that? Some people, the second they say that, listen, I'm being opposed, and so it must mean that I'm not doing what God said. Folks, my greatest revelation of the things of God is when I'm opposed the most. Do you hear me? My biggest battles usually reveal to me that I'm taking a territory and I'm taking a ground that the enemy is not too keen on. And so he's got to stand, he's got to press himself against me. And sometimes those times we find ourselves shrouded away from the presence of the God, and we really have to press into a new level of tenacity. So after Abraham heard and believed, he advanced upon Haran, he continued to Canaan, he worshipped in Bethel. Then it says in Genesis 1:9, and it says, and then they continued traveling by stages towards Negev. And I'm reading from the New Living Translation tonight. It says that all of those things happened, advanced towards Haran, continued to Canaan, worshipped at Bethel. Then it says they continued traveling by stages towards Negev. Maybe your King James says that they continued to journey towards Negev. Folks, think about this just for a second tonight. Wouldn't you think that after experiencing God for the first time like Abraham did, here he was living like everybody else did, probably a pretty decent human being, evidently. God spoke to him. All these things happened. He got led out of his home territory by his father, and then all these things began to happen. He experienced God for the first time. He was seeing God bless him beyond measure. He got a glimpse of the promised land in Canaan land. He didn't get to occupy it yet or take possession, but he definitely got a glimpse there. He went there. Then he had this worship, this extreme worship experience. It says that he built an altar and something happened in Bethel. But somehow, he made a mistake and probably thought he'd arrived at a location. But folks, I don't want us in this year, or you right now, or me right now, to make the mistake of thinking that the process is actually the promise. Do you hear me? The process that you're going through can never be substituted for the promise that God has for you. Now, folks, let me put it this way. I know how long I've been in the ministry. I've been in the ministry and preached the gospel longer than many of you in this place, and nearly most of you in this place have been alive. Really, 30 years of preaching the gospel. So the big proportion of you I have. But you know what, folks? I still see where I'm at as the process. Because you know what? I've not laid hold of the promises that God has showed me afar off yet. And so I'm willing to endure whatever the process looks like to lay hold of the ultimate promise that God has for me. But I think what happens many times in our walk with the Lord Jesus Christ is that we get tired, we get weary within the process, and we give up the fight. But after that joy-filled, all this faith-building experiences of Abraham, it says they continued traveling. How many of you want to continue traveling in your walk with Jesus? You want to, JC? After all that neat stuff, you've seen God do some great things. Even in the last year that you've been here, you've seen God do some things. But literally, that word continue traveling means that they pulled up tent pegs and they didn't put down any roots. In other words, they didn't get comfortable where they were. And folks, this is about 300 years later when the law is given. It reminds me of what happened, that lesson they had to learn in the wilderness when the pillar of cloud by day moved and the pillar of fire by night moved. They didn't get comfortable. They just gathered up their tents and they loaded up their camels or whatever it was, and they just moved wherever it moved. And that's exactly what happened here. They didn't get comfortable. They didn't allow their roots to grow down. They continued traveling. It says, and they continued traveling south by stages towards Negev. Why do you think they traveled there, Gideon? Why do you think that he sent them to this place just south of where they were? Well, brother, I'm glad you answered that question, because that word, literally, it's an unused root, and it means to be parched. You know what it means to be parched? It means to be thirsty. It means to dry. In other words, they were being led into a dry season. Did you hear that? They'd been led by the will of God, by the hand of God, into a dry season. If you were being honest tonight, and I said, have any of you found yourself, maybe recently, maybe right now, you'd say, listen, man, I'm fighting. I found myself, I feel like I've been led into a dry season. Man, there's been times where I've been soaking wet in Jesus, and I've had a lot of joy, and I've had a lot of rest, I've had a lot of peace, I've had a lot of victory. But I got to be real honest with you, Pastor. If something's happening, man, I'm just having to totally do it by faith, because I feel as though I'm in the midst of a dry time and a dry season in my life. Well, I can ask that question to some of you, and I don't even need a response to you, because A, I know you, B, I've had conversations with you, and C, I've seen the evidence of those times in your life. But it says that by the will of God, they were led to a dry season. Folks, here's the thing. This is where you don't even know if you're hearing from God or not. Right? We love to ask people, I do anyway, I love to ask people on the streets, what's God been speaking to you lately? I want to see where they're at. I want to see what kind of season in their life. I want to know what they're listening to. This is where everything that was once easy is now so hard. Have you ever had those times where it's just like the presence of God just dripped off your mouth, and it was just so easy, man? It didn't take these fantastic guys coming together and worshiping. It's just like, man, you just had worship all over you. there was other times it's like, man, I feel like I'm in a spiritual fist fight. Amen. I can't raise my hands. I can't pay attention for 30 seconds, let alone pursue the presence of God. It's like, man, I wish they would just quit for a minute. Enough's enough. The redundancy of that is driving me crazy. And there's other times, man, it could be the exact same thing, but there's something stirring inside of you that you desire after the things of God. But that's also where you find yourself enveloped within the folds of the veil that we've talked about, and you're not able to see on the other side. You know something's there because of the promises of God. You know there's something there. You know God's there by faith. You know that He never wants to leave and never wants to forsake you. You know it's there, but for all intents and purposes, you feel like it's really happened. You're caught up in the folds of that veil between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. This is where isolation becomes very common, but the consolation is very rare. Man, it's easy to feel isolated. It feels like I'm in this by myself, but man, I just don't ever feel consoled. I just never feel like God is wrapping His arms around my life. Now think about this in our text and in our context. Abraham's 75 years old. He'd probably come through at this point some of the most amazing, fulfilling times of his life. He made a decision that required literally risking everything for a destination that was quite literally to him unknown. And he encountered a God in a way that very few people who had ever encountered God before. Man, just hang a plaque up and talk about that, write some books and get a podcast. And man, you could just retire on just that experience alone. Amen? But now he's about to enter into what could become the proving ground of the promises of God, which was that desert place, that parched place, that dry season in his life. After having experienced all these first times, all the most glorious experiences in his life. Folks, listen, I know what that feels like. Has any of you been there? It's like, man, it just seemed like such a powerful time, and this is never going to come to an end. I'm excited. I'm liberated. I'm free. And, man, some of those battles that I had before, man, they just seem like a fleeting thing. That all of a sudden, it's like a floodgate opens up, and not just one or two things hit you, but your kids are in rebellion. You're arguing with your spouse. You lost your job. The taxes are due. All of these things are hitting physically. You're being pursued by all of these maladies. And you said, man, just a month ago or a year ago, it seemed like I was on top of the world. Then all of a sudden you find yourself in that desert place. And you may ask yourself the question, maybe Abraham may have asked himself when he was led out there into the plains of Negev, or that dry place, why can't we just keep gathering more stuff and just keep gathering a bigger crowd? Folks, I believe that's the testimony against the modern church. I believe there was a period of time in church history in the last 30 or 40 years that God brought us through that place of Haran. He was calling the church out to do something incredible, and we found ourselves in that place like I talked about. He said all of those things that Abraham gathered, he took with him into the promised land. But folks, we got so enamored with all the gains, we got so enamored with all the successes, that we forgot that wasn't the promise, that was just the proving ground. We said to ourselves, why can't we just keep gathering more stuff? Why can't we just keep building bigger barns and having bigger crowds and bigger screens and another campus and all these? We just started warehousing things in the kingdom and never really making an impact on cities. Folks, see, I have enough history in the body of Christ, in the church of the Lord Jesus Christ. I've seen that happen with my own eyes in the church age, just like it happened with him. Why can't we just do that? Man, we're not just satisfied with a few dozen faithful people. Man, I'd rather have a few thousand marginal believers that I got to preach saved every single week. Do you hear me? Why can't we just extend our worship time and just bask in His presence? Why can't we just keep doing 24-hour praise and worship? And can't we just keep shining our shoes and never actually doing anything with it? Folks, we've gone through those seasons as well. And it's like if we can just play the drum a little longer, if we can just get another band, if we can just grab another key or have another song or another worship team and just grab something else. And folks, what we've done is rather than getting more and more pure, we've brought all these other things into the mixture. Now we have these artists that are more secular than saved, and it's more sensual than sanctified, and they're the ones that are entertaining the church and establishing the doctrine that another generation is being built upon. And we wonder why. What good, we say to ourselves, could come from a dry season? What good is it that God is bringing me through this? What good is it that, man, I feel so distant? What good is it that God could possibly do in this time in my life? What benefit am I going to reap from a time where I just feel like I'm praying to a brass heaven and I can't reach God? What good? You ever ask yourself those questions when you're going through it? Because, folks, it's easy to rejoice when things are going as planned. Amen. Isn't it easy to rejoice? Man, I'm the head and I'm not the tail. I'm the first and the last. I'm blessed coming in and I'm blessed going out. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Man, it's easy to do that. It's easy to stay encouraged when there's no struggle. Man, I want to see you rejoice in the midst of a struggle. You hear me? I want to see you rejoice in the midst of the battle, amen? It's easy to pray and read the Word when the benefits to you are obvious. But what about when the benefits are not obvious? Do you still want to stand upon the Word? Do you only rejoice and trust and seek Him when things look to be in your favor? Do you? What about when He leads you out into the dry place? Folks, listen. I never want my struggle to be your excuse. You hear me? I never want my struggle to be your excuse, Doug. I never want my struggle that keeps me from walking in faith to be your excuse that you don't walk in faith. I don't want my struggle to worship God to be your excuse that's the reason you don't worship God. I don't want my indifference to reach the lost to be your reason and your excuse for not reaching the lost. Amen? But shouldn't that be our mentality and our attitude? I don't want my struggle to be your excuse. And so when we begin to see things from that perspective, from the vantage point of heaven, and from the vantage point that I believe Abraham finally got a hold of in the dry season, we say to ourselves, yeah, I may have to go through that. I may have to endure the flames of the fiery trial in the furnace heated 7 times over. But you know what? I'm not going to allow my fiery furnace to be your excuse for bowing down to some false god. You hear me? I'm not gonna allow my temptation. I'm not gonna allow my fear. I'm not gonna allow my unbelief. I'm not gonna allow those things to set up shop and tell you that that's the way it should be. Folks, that's the mentality, the heart, the faith that every single one of us have got to walk in this coming year to set an example. And I've talked and preached for years now out of Judges chapter 2 and verse 10 that a generation rose up. A generation rose up on the tail end of miracles. A generation rose up on the tail end of victory. A generation rose up literally on the cusp after this Pentateuch, these 5 books of Moses that saw the miracles. They saw the creation. They saw faith poured out. It says, even after that, somewhere along the line, somebody's struggle became the excuse for a generation. And it says a generation rose up because somebody else didn't believe God or remember the mighty works that He's done. And so they picked up the mantle of unbelief rather than the mantle of the Spirit of God. The dry season conditions us for those times when He's our only source, and all that we gather to ourselves at Haran, or that crossroads, you remember what that meant, is no longer to keep us satiated. You hear me? That's what the dry season's for. It's to tell us that those things that we've gathered, all the experiences, all the pleasures, all the old manna, none of those things can keep us satisfied. It's where reputation is moved out of the way and character is revealed. That's what happens in the dry season. Reputation, you know what it is? It's what other people think about you, or who other people think you are. And character is what? It's who you really are. I want to say something. I hope you get this. As a believer, our character should always be better than our reputation. You hear me? Our character should always be better than our reputation. Let me give you an example of that. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 3 says this, speaking of Jesus prophetically. speaking about his reputation. It says he was despised and rejected. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with the deepest grief. It says, we turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not even care. So, what condition was his reputation in prophetically? That we see it unfold in the Gospels. He didn't have much of reputation. He was not comely. He was not one that people would even look on. He didn't have that type of reputation. Because it says also of him in the Gospel of Luke chapter 7 verse 43. Here's what they accused. They said he's a glutton. He's a drunkard. He's a friend of tax collectors and other sinners. That's what they tried to demean him. They tried to attack his reputation. So men defamed his reputation, but obviously they could not question his character because of who he was. So all the accusations that were levied against his reputation, all of those things were pushed out of the way and nullified because of his character. So is your reputation more noble than your character? Do you have a better reputation than you have a character? Do people think that you're actually better than you really are? Do people think you're closer to God than you really are? Have you been able to put up a front to a degree that people think you're closer to Jesus than you really are? Do they think that you're really more spiritual than you really are? Well, see, that's when it begins to get frightening, when we begin to look at our lives, or maybe perhaps your reputation and your character are both in shambles. But after all this, though, it says in Genesis 12:2 that while on their journey into the dry places of Negeb, that a severe famine struck the land of Canaan, forcing Abram to go down to Egypt, where he lived as a foreigner. So first he was thirsty. Now instead of famine came, now he's hungry to go along with it. Folks, it's bad enough to be thirsty, but it's twice as bad to be hungry and thirsty. So now his character is being put to the test before the promise can be revealed in his life. And folks, listen, I believe that your character is about to be put to the test to the degree that your promises can be not just revealed, but can be possessed. God is getting those things out of the way that would somehow nullify or disqualify you from his promises. I'm going to read Genesis chapter 12, 11 through 20. Speaking of Abraham, after all of these things had happened, he says, as he was approaching the border of Egypt, Abram said to his wife Sarai, he said, look, you're a very beautiful woman. He said, when the Egyptians see you, they're going to say, this is my wife. Let's kill him, then we can have her. So please tell them you're my sister. Then they'll spare my life, and they'll treat me well because of their interest in you. And sure enough, when Abraham arrived in Egypt, everyone noticed Sarai's beauty. And when the palace officials saw her, they sang her praises to Pharaoh, their king, and Sarai was taken into his palace. And Pharaoh gave Abraham many gifts. Look what happened. He gave, again, is this the crossroads once again where he gathers all the stuff in like Haran? Pharaoh gave him many gifts because of her sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants. What did he give him? Male and female servants. What did he give him? Male and female servants. Keep that in mind for just a moment. And camels. In other words, he got a lot more stuff. He got a lot more stuff because he was willing to sacrifice his character for his reputation and even for his skin in this case. It says in verse 17, though, but the Lord sent terrible plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because Sarai, Abram's wife, it says, so Pharaoh summoned Abram and accused him sharply. What have you done to me? He demanded. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say to me she's my sister and allow me to take her as my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and get out of here. You know, the implication here that I read, later on this exact same thing happened again. But in the other one, it specifically says that he did not take her as his wife. He wasn't intimate. This actually, the implication is that he actually allowed his wife to enter into sexual relations with Pharaoh. And so he was willing to adulterate the promise. Folks, that's where we get the James 4:4 words and the dialogue. You adulterers and adulterers, do you not know that your friendship with the world makes you the enemy of God? He was willing to offer up a covenant relationship in order to save his own skin. That's what it says. It says, you take her, get out of here. Pharaoh ordered some of the men to escort them out. I'm going to escort you out of here because I don't even want you present. And he sent them out of the country along with his wife and all those possessions. Folks, listen to this. Over the course of the next few years, about 11, From the time of Abraham's initial call from God through Genesis chapter 15, things begin to happen in this dry time. Abraham, his nephew, and Lot, you've read the story. What happened? Conflict within their camps. They separated. So he had conflict within the body, had a situation that arose and began to pull them apart. Abram would rescue Lot and his household because remember the kings and all came together and they invaded Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot and all his family was taken. Abraham had to find himself rescuing them. So here he was out chasing his nephew. Abraham would go ahead and meet Melchizedek in the valley of Shavah, which means the king's valley. So he had some awesome, incredible experiences right there, some trying times, some things that tested his mettle. Then in chapter 15, the real trial began. Somebody say the real trial. The real trial. Then look what it says in verse 1 of Genesis chapter 15. It says, sometime later. Somebody say sometime later. It says, sometimes later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, do not be afraid, Abram. I will protect you, and your reward will be great. Okay, there's the promise that's attached to that. But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Okay? He's tipping the balance. He's tipping the hand to the promise. He says, since you've given me no children. Now look what he says. Eleazar of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. He said, you've given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir. Then the Lord said to him, verse 4, no. Somebody say, no. No. You can't have it your way. No. You can't make your own plan. No. Just because it seems right doesn't make it right. No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son who will be your heir. Then the Lord took Abram aside and said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can, how many descendants you will have. In other words, your descendants are going to be like the stars in the heaven and like the grains of sand upon the beach. And it says, at that moment in verse 6 of Genesis chapter 15, it says, Abram believed the Lord, and it was counted unto him for righteousness because of his faith. What did he believe? He believed that those promises would come to pass. Those promises that happened on the tail end of a dry season would come to pass. As it said, because he believed those things when they seemed unbelievable, those things were counted unto him for righteousness. Folks, listen, you have a hard time believing the unbelievable. I said this past week, I said, listen, I have a real hard time of doing the discouragement thing. I really do. It's hard for me to conjure up discouragement. You know, kind of the running joke around here and with me, people say, well, Pastor, how you doing? The running joke is, well, I'm just barely making it. And people know it's a joke because it is a joke. You know what? I'm just holding on, but I'm getting worse. You know, I say that as a joke all the time because it's just the opposite. I have a hard time doing the discouragement thing, but I have a real easy time doing the faith thing. I really do. Why? Because I have seen over the course of many years, through many trials, through many difficulties, through many situations, some of them that still exist, that God has always been faithful. I believe that I can trust him because he is trustworthy. I believe that he's called faithful, so he's going to do faithful. I just can't help it. Does that mean everything's fixed and all these things? It doesn't mean everything's fixed. It means that everything is faith. It means that the fixing the situation is not my reality. What God said has become the reality in which I choose by an act of my own will and my volition to walk in accordance with. Now, you can see things the way you want to see things, but I'm going to see things the way he sees things. You hear me? I believe that the one that's the author and the finisher, the one that spoke outside of time, is able to keep those things that I commit to him. And so I'm going to keep my mind, I'm going to keep my destiny, I'm going to keep my hopes, and I'm going to keep those things solidly applied to him and in the confines of his presence. You hear me? That's what I want to press towards, even in a deeper and more meaningful way as we come into this year. It said, the Lord to him said, no, that won't be your heir. He believed God, and it was accounted unto righteousness because of his faith. In verse 7, and he says, the Lord told him, I'm the one who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land as your possession. Somebody say amen? Amen. Yet. Folks, probably every single one of us, I could do an inventory across this room. And I could say, you remember at 17. You remember when he gave you that promise and you believed God and it was accounted unto you for righteousness. You remember that, Christina. You remember that, don't you? You remember when you were that unwed mother at 18 years old and that child right back there that's now a mother herself with a baby in her womb and married. You remember when he brought you out. You remember that, don't you? that it didn't look possible. How about you, Douglas? After 10 years, you got out of prison at 22 years old, and man, God began to do something. You had that experience. Man, you believe God when it's unbelievable, but you don't know where I came from. You don't know what I went through. What about you, Polly, and all those things, the baggage and the unmet expectation, and now all the things that God is unfolding, giving you a husband and a son, and all these miraculous things. He's using you to do things in the kingdom. Man, you see the power of God moving. Man, the blessings of God. Ryan, when you were out there and you heard the preaching of the gospel out there on a street, that you were just, man, I was just minding my own business. I'm just a student at a motorcycle college here in Daytona Beach, and I hear the word, and boom, God does something in my heart, in my life. That moment that God showed up on the scene, you remember those things, and yet, chapter 16, verse 1. All of that stuff, all of those promises, all that revelation. Now, Sarah, Abraham's wife, had not been able to bear children for him. Here's what I told you to remember about all those gifts from Egypt. But she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. Oh, my. I bet he thought when they ran him and they escorted him out of Egypt, it was all over. You ever paid much attention and thought about that? It was bad enough what happened. It was bad enough what went down. Man, we put some territory between my stupidity in Egypt and where I am all these years later. I've come out of the dry season. But it says specifically, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar who was acquired during that dry season, during that time that he allowed his guard down and he ceased to walk by faith. So Sarai said to Abraham, the Lord has prevented me from having children, so you go and sleep with my servant. Why? Because he had already normalized that. You normalized that type of activity when I went and had to sleep with Pharaoh because you were fearful of your life. And we brought a servant. We brought something out of that. We brought the residual effects of you normalizing that into our home. So it's normalized. Now what I want you to do is I want you to go lay with this Egyptian servant. And perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarah's proposal. So Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in Canaan land. That's how long it had been. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress, Sarah, with contempt. Then Sarah said to Abram, this is your fault. You know what? It was her fault. It was his fault. Why? Because in the dry season, rather than just trusting God through it, he said, I want to lie. I want my reputation to be standing longer than my character. She said, I put my servant in your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with contempt. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me. And Abram replied, look, she is your servant, so deal with her as you see fit. Then Sarah treated Hagar harshly, that she finally ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside the spring of water in the wilderness along the road. And the angel said to her, Hagar, Sarah's servant, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm running from my mistress, Sarai, she replied. And the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can even count. Folks, here's the consequence. Here's the Ishmael effect that comes upon somebody's life. You may have put distance between it, but when you fail in the dry season, when you abdicate your faith in the dry season, something begins to multiply. Be not deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And the angel said, now that you're pregnant, you'll give birth to a son, and you're to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. God hears. Now, what does God hear? Folks, the word tells us that we're going to give an account for every word that we speak from our mouth. God hears. Our murmuring and complaining, God hears. Your profanity, your anger, your unforgiveness, God hears. And there's a consequence to what God hears. And every day that you see that boy rise up, you're going to know that God hears. God's going to hear that you believe that your reputation was more important than your character. God hears. God hears those things that come into your ears and those things that come out of your mouth. God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress. And this son of yours, now listen to the description of Ishmael. He's going to be a wild man. He's going to be untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all of his relatives. Folks, what was the appeal that allowed that to happen? I want to give you 4 things quickly tonight. I'm not going to be much longer. 4 things tonight that cause Hagar or situations like that to be appealing to you. That can cause, if you do not cut those things off, it can cause the consequences or the Ishmael effect to have its effect in your life. The first thing is familiarity. Hagar's appeal, the first thing was familiarity. Why was a woman like this, why did she have that ability to come in and become intimate in that situation? Because she had allowed to become familiar with their home. Folks, what is it that you make familiar to? You know what familiarity is? Familiarity is something that you allow common things that should be reserved for something else, an intimate situation. The great fiasco, I believe, the great tragedy in modern times is the familiarity of the dating scene. I hear people that had a boyfriend or a girlfriend and they use terms like my ex. Your ex what? Your ex perversion? Your ex sin? Your ex... Folks, there's no ex in those type of relationships because there never was before. Ex means there was something that was that no longer is. It's your ex sin. And so we create this familiarity and push together in these things. So let me create an intimate environment that's not reserved for that. And so by the time a young man or a young woman decides to marry a woman, they've got all this, marry a man or a woman, they've got all this history with all these other people. And so in their mind, that familiarity allows them to go places in their mind that they should not have ever been. If you've ever been in that, in sexual immorality, some of you young people who get married, you think that I do is going to fix it. No, what you're going to find yourself doing is daily having to renew your mind through the reading of the Word and say, God, take those images, take those memories away from me. If you think that I do in a piece of paper and a preacher saying you can kiss the bride is going to fix it, I got another thing coming. The only thing that's going to fix it is not become familiar to begin with. And so here we tell you a standard. Listen, don't get yourself involved in a familiar situation. Don't become familiar. And I use a relationship as a means because we can understand those things. If you find yourself confining or being confided in with a member of the opposite sex, I got news for you. You are creating a Hagar experience in the way. You're creating something that's going to allow an Ishmael to rise up, and that Ishmael is going to have an open hostility against the promise that God has for young men, young women, you single ones. I tell you what, if you're going around, and I don't care if you're an intern or a grandson or anybody else, if you are finding yourself engaging in that situation, I am warning you. I don't want you knocking on my door and crying and bemoaning and saying, why did this happen, when I am warning you right here? What is this, the 6th of December, 2019, and you're wondering, my heart is broken, I'm destroyed. You don't have to be hurt. You don't have to be destroyed. Cut off the familiarity with those situations. I was telling a young woman the other day, she's here today, I said, listen, I got news for you. Young men don't have girls that are friends. Young men have girlfriends. If they're going to be friendly towards a girl, it's to close the distance and become familiar in the hopes of her becoming a girlfriend. That's the way men are wired. Men are wired in the sense when they're lost towards that conquest, to bridge that gap. If men have friends, they're other men. When men have girlfriends, they're girls. Women are wired a totally different. And so they become susceptible and vulnerable to them, because a woman can say to herself, I can have all types of friends. Young women, men are not wired that way. They're not looking for girls for friends. They're looking for girl friends. So the danger is becoming over familiar and giving information and receiving information that creates a soul tie, an emotional bondage, and all of these things that pull you in. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone else. I'm going to give you information I've never given anyone else, that it obligates you emotionally. Am I lying? You that have been there and done that and have suffered the consequences. So what allowed that to happen was familiarity. The next thing that happened was accessibility. They were brought in. Abram sinned, Abram fell. All of these things were given to him at the new crossroads in the dry place, including the Egyptian servants. So they were given access into their home. And so with him saying, listen, you know what? Rather than saying, listen, I don't want anything from this. I'm not going to take anything out of this failure. I'm not going to hold on to anything. I'm not going to be like Achan burying some treasure underneath my tent. Listen, this thing was a failed experience. This thing was a failed relationship. This was a bad idea. And you can give me your livestock. You can give me your gold. You can give me your servant. None of that stuff is coming with me. Because the second he did that, years later, suddenly that Egyptian servant came back to bite him. Folks, do not give access to the adversary into your promise. You hear me? Do not give him access. Once you give him access and you keep those things and you file them away, don't give him access to the things that you see, to the things that you listen to, through the relationships that you have, through any of that stuff. Don't give him access, because once he has access, access produces influence, and that influence will ultimately bring about an action that will disqualify you from the promises of God. The third thing that made Hagar appealing was the immediacy. Abraham just got tired of waiting. He got tired of waiting. He got tired of hearing Sarah nag. You hear me? He allowed the weight of time to bear down upon him. You don't understand what I'm going through. I'm just tired of hearing it every day. I keep telling her what God said, but she keeps saying, you know what, she's too old and we can't do that. It's not going to work. You know what? I'm just tired of it. Don't it remind you of Demas having loved this present world? He ran out of time, that increment of time. He's forsaken me. Listen, okay, whatever. I guess we'll do it. So he wanted an immediate fix to a promise that had eternal implications. How about you? Are you willing to settle on something that you can get now that's going to cost you later on? Undoubtedly, some of you are wrestling with some of those decisions right now. I need a quick fix. I need God to do something in the now. Folks, I'm going to stand as a warning. I want to stand as a watchman tonight. Don't allow the immediacy to bait you into something because you're tired of waiting. I want it now. And I'll use relationships again. If you think to yourself, listen, I've got to have that relationship now. I've got to have that fixed now because it may not come along again. Well, if that's the case, let it go. Let it go. You don't need it. You don't need to enter into those situations that will bring destruction into your life. Now, next year, 10 years, 50 years from now, you don't need it in your life. God can keep those things that you could commit to Him. So familiarity, accessibility, immediacy. And here's the biggie, folks. It's this word called egocentricity. Egocentricity. I'm going to give you a definition of that big crazy word. It's having or regarding the self or the individual as the center of all things. In other words, you're self-centered. An egocentric philosophy ignores everything else, ignores counsel, it ignores beliefs, it ignores attitudes, it ignores consequence of everything except their own. I know what you're saying, but I'm going to do me. I know what you're telling me, but I'm going to do me. Folks, I got news for you. I've been at it a long time. I'm a chief pastor. There's people outside the ranks of this ministry that I inquire in, I get counsel from all the time. Period. I look to people that don't have my same blind spots. They don't have my same responsibilities. People like Dr. Tao and Brother Ravenhill, I've asked these men questions. Hey, what do you think about such and such? Other things, financial matters. I got guys that are businessmen and things of that. And I said, hey, listen, here's my situation. You do that all the time. What are your thoughts on those subject matters? I don't want to be so self-centered that I'm not seeking wisdom and a multitude of counsel, period. I do. I get people that don't have a vested, quote-unquote, interest in the things that I do. They can give me an honest opinion and an investment in those things. Say, yeah, listen, I think you're on point. Or, hey, think about this. Here's another way of looking at situations. Why? Because if I'm going to give wisdom, I better be willing to get it from somewhere. Because if you don't, this son of yours is going to be a wild man. He's going to be as untamed as a wild donkey. He's going to raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all of his relatives. Folks, that's the Ishmael effect. What is it as you examine your heart to see if you're in the right faith? What is it that you would say to yourself, you know what? In this year, in this opportunity, man, I've got to cut ranks with some of these things that made Hagar so appealing to me. Where have I allowed the familiarity of situations or sin or compromise or the accessibility of things that found an easy way into my life or the immediacy that I've got to have it and I'm not willing to wait upon the Lord or the egocentric? What are the things that I've become so self-centered about that are easily going to find me disqualified from the things that God has for me? Because I don't want those things to be present in my life and to raise up something hostile that's going to overthrow my promises. Would you stand tonight and we're going to pray?